Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is an incredibly exciting panel. When I got invited to moderate it, I was really impressed. I said, I'm going to moderate them. This is like, you know, they invited the monkey to run the zoo. But here I am. We got incredible panelists. We're going to go. John Wiener has dreamed all his life of a panel that went in reverse alphabetical order. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order, except that John Dean wants to go last, so he's going to go out of order. Turn off your cell phones. Okay. John is a genuine intellectual. He writes about history, and he writes for the New York Times Magazine, New Republic. His new book is Historians in Trouble. If there is ever a cable station for intellectuals, this will be the Desperate Housewives. No, it's true. It's true. I mean, the first historian is like this demon witch that, you know, like that evil female career woman that always shows up in Hollywood movies. And except in this book, it has a happy end. She gets appointed to a high administrative post by the Bush administration.
Not the one who married the vice president?
Let's see. Science Friction, which is Michael Shermer's book. Michael has been a defender of rationality for years and years and years. He's the publisher of Skeptic. He's the guy who came out with the idea of calling people who actually think brights. And he's also the author of Why People Believe Weird Things, How We Believe, The Science of Good and Evil. And what I think, kind of what I think is going on here, the title of the panel is Deceits, Deception, and Cover-Up. So, you know, John's new book is dealing with historians, and this is a field in which accuracy and accountability and being able to prove what you say are the gold standard. That's what you're supposed to do. Michael's book is about how we, not so much his current book, but his previous books are about how people believe and why they believe in stupid things, which is probably the most important issue in America today. Most of you know, I mean, there is a paper on the East Coast with a name really similar to the one that sponsors this festival. Probably every literate person in the world has read that newspaper, and I assume you're all literate because you're at a book fair, so in that case, you've all read Maureen Dowd. You know. Who's been, you know, right there on the scene with Bush 1, Bush 2, and Bush 2.5. And she also has a Pulitzer Prize. Okay, her book is Bush World. There it is. Bush World, enter at your own risk. And, okay, Eric Alterman, media critic. Eric is best known for What Liberal Media, The Truth About Bias in the News, and in which he proved conclusively that Maureen Dowd is actually a conservative. His new book is When Presidents Lie. I thought the subtitle was going to be When Their Lips Move, but the subtitle is A History of Official Deception and Its Consequences. And the consequences now seem to be get reelected, and which it was under Nixon, right? And John Dean. I think everybody knows who John is. John is the only Republican that I'm aware of that turned into a really good writer. He's also, his current book is Worse Than Watergate, and he is also the author of Lost Honor, The Rehnquist Choice, a biography of Warren Harding, and Blind Ambition. Okay, John, in reverse alphabetical order, go for it.
Pleasure. Well, it's a real honor and a thrill to be sitting next to John Dean and on a panel with Maureen Dowd. Let me tell you who Larry Beinhardt is. Larry Beinhardt's new because the librarian, but this is the man who wrote Wag the Dog. This is the man who wrote Wag the Dog. Anyway, I'm interested in why it is that when academics, professors, historians are accused of misconduct, that sometimes they end up on page one and find their careers ruined, and sometimes they end up appointed by President Bush to important offices. Historians have been in the news a lot lately, and the news has not been that good. You may know of Ward Churchill, the ethnic studies professor at Colorado, who the governor wanted to fire for his outrageous statements about some of the victims of 9/11. Maybe you heard about Middle East studies at Columbia, where professors there have been charged with abusive treatment of students. I'm interested in talking today about two cases of research misconduct by historians, one of which resulted in a career ending and one of which resulted in a Bush White House appointment. And I want to start with the latter. The current National Archivist of the United States, now probably most of you don't care too much about this, but John Dean cares about this, and I care about this. The current archivist is a man named...
You should care about it.
You should care. Thank you. Thank you. He's a man named Alan Weinstein. He was nominated by George Bush and took office just last month. He has written, he's a scholar, a historian of Soviet espionage in the United States. And he has been charged with research misconduct in his two most important books. The most recent one is called The Haunted Wood. It's a history of Soviet espionage in the United States that's based on the archives of the KGB. But what Alan Weinstein did was he and his publisher paid for exclusive access to this archive. They paid $100,000 to the KGB retirement fund. And in exchange for the $100,000, they not only got access to the documents, but they got exclusive access, which means no one else is allowed to see the documents that they cite. Now, this is not only a bad idea for people who wonder if Alan Weinstein quoted the documents correctly, it's also a violation of the Code of Ethics of the International Association of Archivists, which says the principle is that documents should be open to everyone. So the job of National Archivist, the National Archives is the place where the official secrets of the United States are kept. And the public, we of course, want to know as much about our government as possible because, of course, democracy depends on an informed electorate. And presidents all have secrets. Democrats as well as Republicans have secrets. So it's the job of the archivist to represent the public in its quest for information about what government is doing. Access to documents is what this job is about. But the person that George Bush appointed to be in charge of the secrets, to be representing us in our effort to find out information about what the government is doing, himself has a record of paying archives to keep their documents secret from his own critics. This seems wrong. But it's not the first time he's done it. His previous book was called Perjury. It's a history of the Alger Hiss-Whittaker Chambers case, which was crucial in the beginnings of the Cold War. And that was a book based largely on interviews. And it came out almost 25 years ago. In that book, the It was considered to have provided conclusive evidence that Algerhis was guilty as charged of spying for the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s. But the editor of The Nation magazine, Victor Navasky, a person who Eric Alterman writes for regularly and I write for intermittently, did a very simple fact check. He got in touch with the first 6 people interviewed in the book, asked them if they'd been quoted correctly, and they all said no. 100% of them said they'd been misrepresented, misquoted, or otherwise their position had been distorted. Now, everyone who does interviews knows that often the people you interview are unhappy with the way their interviews turn out in print. It wasn't what they hoped for. It wasn't what they thought you were going to do. It happens. So this doesn't mean that Alan Weinstein is necessarily wrong about this, but the way to do it, and he knew what to do, he said he would make the tapes of his interviews available to Victor Navasky, The Nation magazine, and anybody else who wanted to see them. That was in 1980. To this day, no one has ever been allowed, none of the critics have ever been allowed to see those documents. Only the friends of Alan Weinstein have been allowed to see those documents. Now, while this seems a bit deceptive, it's also a violation of the Statement on Standards of the American Historical Association and of the Association of Oral Historians, which says that oral history documents are supposed to be made available to other researchers as at an appropriate archive, like the UCLA Oral History Archive, the Columbia Oral History Archive. That's what he was supposed to do. He knew he was supposed to do that. He promised to do that. He even signed a deed of gift, Alan Weinstein did, that he would deposit these at the Truman Library in Missouri. Truman Library never got them. So here's a guy, it's almost as if the White House said, here is a historian who has spent 20 years stonewalling his critics. He's our kind of guy. And that's the man who's in charge of the official records of all of us, of our government. Now, the contrast I want to make in the minute I have left?
You got it.
The opposite fate. Michael Bellil wrote a book called Arming America. It's a history of gun culture in the United States. It argued that Americans had fewer guns in the late 18th and early 19th century than historians had previously believed. This was taken to be a significant argument about gun control today, although I'm not really sure it has much to do with whether there are too many guns today. But there were serious questions raised about his documentation. Unlike Alan Weinstein, Michael Bellil provided his critics with all of his documentation. He gave them all of his materials, told them what archives he'd been to. Turned out he'd screwed up a lot of this. There was a lot of errors in what he did. A distinguished committee of historians concluded, in fact, that he was guilty of fraud in one of his tables, and he resigned a position as tenured professor of history at Emory University. Now, what if Michael Bellil, historian of gun culture in America, had done what Alan Weinstein did, had refused to share his archival documents, had refused to make his materials available to other scholars? There would have been a tremendous outcry. Why was it that the critic of the gun lobby had his career ended while the person with ties to the Republican White House had his career advanced? And why was it that the stories told in the media about this were that Michael Bellil was guilty of research fraud, while no one seemed to care about the questions raised about Alan Weinstein, except for Eric Alterman and me, actually.
And Victor.
And Victor, who's on another panel at this hour. I conclude that the right has been much more successful than the left when it comes to cases of charges of misconduct by historians. The right has been able to reward those it considers its allies and punish those it considers its enemies. And that's all I have to say about this.
Okay. Michael, you're up next.
Okay. Good morning. How we doing? I have to stand up for this. I'm going to do a psychic reading, so you have to stand up for this. I am Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society and the publisher of Skeptic magazine. We investigate claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups and cults and claims of all kinds between science, pseudoscience, non-science, bad science, voodoo science, junk science, non-science, and nonsense. And as you may have noticed, there's a lot of that out there. Some people call us debunkers, but let's face it, there's a lot of bunk that needs debunking. So in my 5 minutes, I'm just going to basically talk about psychics and deception, because they go together, and then cult leaders and conspiracy theorists, and then finally the general concept of deception as a whole. So we begin with what we do, kind of like trash collecting. It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it, and that is debunk the psychics, because it looks like they're able to read people's minds and talk to the dead, that kind of thing. Oh, I should point out, anybody can talk to the dead. It's getting the dead to talk back. That's the difficult part. And that's where the deception comes in. It looks something like this. There's some spirits in the room coming through here. Just a moment. Yes. Somebody on this side of the room has lost somebody. They've passed over. Which is convenient, since I'm standing on this side of the room and the cameras are right here. That's how it works in these studio audiences. It's funny how the dead congregate in television studios in New York and Los Angeles. But that's, you know, that's the way the spirit world works. And so there's somebody coming through. I'm getting something around here, like an R name, a Robert, a Richard, something like that, a father figure. Could be a grandfather, grandmother, mother, father, uncle, close friend of some kind. Yes, I think it's you, sir. Yes, I do. I do think it's you. You were nodding in a certain way. Hang on, just a minute. Yes. He's telling me something about in your garage you have some power tools that are broken that you've been meaning to fix, right? And how did I know? Well, they told me. And you, ma'am, I'm being told something about you have a box of photographs in your closet you've been meaning to put into photo albums. You don't, sir, I'm getting something about, I see a calendar on your wall. It's an out-of-date calendar. You've been meaning to take it down. It's an 04 calendar. Most importantly, you, ma'am, I'm getting something about how you're a thoughtful, intelligent, good communicator with a good sense of humor. You're shy sometimes, but at other times you're outgoing. All right, why would anybody fall for this kind of shtick? And I'm not particularly good at it. I don't do it very often. If I did it a couple hours a day like the pros, you know, you'd get much smoother at it. And it's because people want to believe that it's true. It's a confirmation bias. You look for and accept confirmatory evidence for what you already believe, and then you just filter out all the rest that doesn't fit. You remember the hits, you forget the misses. So if I were to do an actual reading on you, did you used to wear your hair longer when you were younger, by the way? Yeah. And there's something about an earring. You have one that you're missing the other, and you're hanging on to it because you're hoping to find. There's a whole book of this stuff, this kind of spiel you can use. All right, so are these psychics deceptive intentionally? I'm not sure. I think for sure some of them are. That is, they are out-and-out con artists fraudulently deceiving the public to make money. That's true, but that's not very interesting to me. That's just like a street con. What's more interesting is the possibility that they've self-deceived. They've convinced themselves they can do this because with practice they've gotten better at it and better at it. And you, the people coming for the readings, give them positive feedback, which makes them more confident. And the more confident you are, the better you get at it. The more convincing you are to your clients, who then are ever more convinced you're real and feedback on that. And that's why I think most cult leaders are not out-and-out fraud con artists. I think they believe the lie. And if you believe the lie, then your body and face does not give off the cues of lying. So, sort of wrap it up here. I think there was an evolutionary arms race in the long history of human evolution between lying and lying detection. I think we're pretty good liars and pretty good lie detectors. I think the liars have a slight advantage over the lie detectors unless you spend a lot of time with somebody. And then you can collect enough data to have a sense that they're trustworthy or not. And so I think when we encounter somebody once, they can get away with the lie. You can buy into the deceit. When you interact with somebody a lot, it's a lot harder to do it because they start giving off those subtle cues. And there's interesting research on this now about facial expressions and cues that we give off. when you look at the camera and say, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," and you think this guy is really good, but you know he's lying. All right, so if with enough exposure to that individual, it becomes clear there's something off there. There's something untrustworthy. Okay, why would that be? And I think, so this is sort of where I wrap it up with the Science of Good and Evil book on how this all evolved, that we evolved as a social primate species in these small groups of a couple of dozen to a couple hundred individuals, in which shunning and other informal social means of behavior control worked just fine to take care of the liars, deceivers, cheaters, outliers, the frauds, and so on. We can deal with that fine when everybody knows each other, and those kinds of people, through much exposure, get exposed, and so on. What happens when societies get large, populations get into the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? It's too easy for the outliers to hide in the nooks and crannies of a large society, and that's why I argue this was the birth of religion and government about the same time, state societies and large religion. Religion is a form of behavior control. It's a moral behavior control. It's not just that we're going to shun you, it's that you're not going to get away with it because Mr. Big is keeping track. But even that's not enough, because there are some people who don't care if Mr. Big is keeping track. So we have to deal with them in the here and now, and that's what you need the state for. And that's how we got to where we are, basically in 7 minutes. Thank you.
Maureen, are you ready for this?
Well, can you guys hear me? Yeah? I didn't know I was supposed to prepare something, so I'm going to be a little inarticulate here, but that's okay, because even when I prepare, I'm inarticulate, so you're not going to notice the difference. My favorite quote about Washington is one that Russell Baker said in his memoir, which was that covering Washington was just a matter of sitting in ever grander marble halls waiting for someone ever more important to come out and lie to you. And I grew up in Washington, and my brothers were Capitol Hill pages in the 50s, and their job was mostly to, when senators would get drunk, they'd get the brass spittoons, they'd step into them and not be able to get them off their legs, and my brother would have to pull it off, or when their wives would call, different senators, and they'd be in their hideaway offices with their mistresses. My brothers would have to keep the wife from coming. So I never actually grew up thinking Washington was, a totally pure place. But my dad was a police detective who was in charge of Capitol Hill security, and he would judge politicians by whether they were phony or not. And he was born in Ireland, and his favorite phrase was, they're full of prunes. So, and I think I took that on kind of as an ideology, because he would never mention their party. He would just say they're a phony or they're not a phony. So when I wrote Bush World, I wished I were Evil Lenoir, because only he could do justice to the story, which is, to me, one of the most amazing. It's like a heist story. I call it Ocean's 9/11, because although Wolfowitz is no Brad Pitt, believe me. Because these guys took all of our emotions and fears that we felt after 9/11 and diverted them to a plan that had been in the making in their heads for a decade at American Enterprise Institute. And it was kind of a perfect storm. They all had different reasons for it, but it was not what they told us. It was a threat to our imminent security. So now we're in a very interesting ends justifies the means situation now. And I have seen enough Shakespearean plays to know that ends justifies the means usually ends up with the stage littered with bodies at the end of the play. So I'm very skeptical about that. But everyone now is saying, well, wasn't Bush right? And shouldn't you apologize to Wolfowitz? Weren't they right? And to quote my friend and fellow columnist Richard Cohen, it really, I don't want to be I'm not at all churlish. If things go well in the Middle East, I'm thrilled, you know, for the sake of our country and the Middle East and our troops who can come home sooner. But I don't really care if democracy spreads from the Nile to the Tigris. It is not going to change the fact that lying to the American people and ginning up evidence and turning, you know, all of our institutions into, you know, distorting them to distort truth for an ideological goal is right. And it's never going to be right to tell the American people, to not tell the American people the truth about why you go to war, or the families or the troops. So I would never change my mind about that. You know, as far as just random thoughts about Washington, I mean, it's just a remarkable time there, because what we're watching is the Republicans trying to turn America into a theocracy, while the Bush administration desperately tries to stop Iraq from becoming a theocracy. Which is one of these great circular things, in the same way that Bush 41 went to war with Saddam in Iraq to establish the principle that one nation can't unilaterally invade another. And his son went to war with Saddam in Iraq to establish the principle that one nation can unilaterally invade another. So Republicans are better hypocrites. You know, they just have a gift and a talent for it. As the nuns would say when I was little, they're just great, bold, brazen pieces. And they, you know, they can just say more outrageous things, and then the Democrats won't have a hard time calling them on it, because they say, well, free speech or something. So, you know, I came across a flyer yesterday that says that Bill O'Reilly is going to be leading a, you know, on a cruise, a Love Boat kind of cruise in November. And it's called a Values for America cruise. And here's the part I love. It's to the Caribbean, which is exactly what he got in trouble on the phone fantasizing, that if he were with this girl in the Caribbean, you know, he could liquor her up and loo for her. So now he's on a values cruise there, so it just proves that Republicans are geniuses. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, to pick up on something Maureen said at the beginning of her remarks about how those of us who didn't think this war was a good idea for any number of reasons appear to be on the defensive now for whatever reason. To me, this is another example of how incredibly effective the right has been at controlling the political discourse. I got a Gallup poll emailed to me on Tuesday. I get them every Tuesday morning. And this Gallup poll demonstrated that 53% of American people think it was a mistake to go to war in Iraq. These numbers have been consistent for the past 4 months. The previous Gallup poll I got the week before that, looked at George W. Bush's popularity ratings and compared them to previous second-term presidents at this point in their second term, and he is the most unpopular second-term president at this point in second term since Gallup began doing the polls. And yet over and over we hear about this popular president persecuting the successful war, and that those of us who warned against it because of what things that later demonstrated to be true are supposed to be on the defensive. And that's, I mean, they've won the game when they've controlled the discourse that effectively, because you never get to the actual problems that they've caused. It's all, you know, that's got nothing to do with anything except I got the mic here, and last night I spoke in a synagogue in Irvine, and I started talking. I picked up this story that I had read to my daughter about the Bible recently, and there was a rabbi there, and I hassled him about that story. And it's just I gotta come a little bit prepared to these things, because thoughts pop into my head, and I go with them a little too long, and we've only got 5 minutes, and I haven't even mentioned this book here, you know. This book that I wrote about presidential lying, called When Presidents Lie. Thanks, I noticed you didn't hold it up the first time. Um, it's not a book that's actually morally preening about lying. It's not a book that says lying is always wrong. My daughter's actually here. She's got her headphones on, so she can't hear me, which is a good thing. Because I tell her that lying is always wrong. But the rest of us should understand that there are times in our lives, if your wife really does look fat 5 minutes before you're supposed to go to a dinner party, you have to lie. More seriously, when Huck Finn and Jim are on that boat, and the Jim's owners are up on the cliff and demand to know from Huck, is his companion white or black? And Huck lies and says white. That's a noble lie. That's a life-saving lie. I can't imagine anybody who would think that Huck would have done the right thing if he had sent Jim back into a life of slavery and degradation merely for telling the truth. Immanuel Kant argues that if there's a murderer at your door with a gun and he says, where is my intended victim? I would like to go kill them now. You have a moral obligation to tell the truth. Because if you lie, then you become responsible for what happens next. And if you don't lie, then it's not your problem. I like to think Immanuel Kant wouldn't really tell the truth in that situation. I like to think he's just being cheeky with us, and that's his very fancy way of doing so. But it's true, as we heard at the beginning, that most presidents do lie, and they lie with pretty a considerable degree of regularity. I think that George Bush's lies are the least of our problems. I mean, I really don't think George Bush lied any more than, believe it or not, Franklin Roosevelt. Certainly not more than Lyndon Johnson and John Dean's friend. What was his name again? The thing about the Bush administration is not that they lie, it's that they have a contempt for the truth, which is something different. Roosevelt, the book is set up to be a pragmatic argument for truth. In other words, Roosevelt lied about Yalta. John Kennedy lied about the deal that settled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lyndon Johnson lied about the Gulf of Tonkin situation. He didn't lie on the day of it. He lied a few days later when he found out the truth. And Ronald Reagan lied about everything he ever said about Central America. And that all of these presidents paid a pragmatic price for having lied, that they all would have been much, much better off had they simply told the truth to the country and bitten the bullet at the moment. But none of them. Roosevelt was quite sick at the time. He died 6 weeks after he gave his speech about Yalta, so that might be a special case. But none of them had the sort of small form of political courage that would have been required to tell the country an unpleasant truth at the moment, and so they ended up finding themselves in a web of lies, which is actually, when you think about it, quite natural, because if a president tells a consequential lie about something, then he's got to keep lying, because presidents their words create a reality, and that reality is separate from the reality that they were originally talking about. So they end up dealing with the lies rather than with the truth. Meanwhile, the truth comes back to bite them in the ass, because reality doesn't go away. So in each of those cases, each of these presidents paid a significant price. Roosevelt and Kennedy were not around to pay the price anymore, because they both died, but their parties paid the price, and they would have paid the price had they stayed. In other words, it was a bad political move seen in the long term, and I think that's organic in the system of the ecosystem of lying in politics. But I think what's happened is that we've gotten too used to lying, even though, like I said, it's not always the worst thing in the world, but we've gotten too used to lying, and because our political system has ceased to hold presidents to any standard of lying, that we don't even really pay attention to whether or not what they're saying is lying or the truth. It's all a question of whether or not it smooths the workings of the system. That the Bush administration has taken this insight and it has metastasized it. And so it's not simply that that you can't believe what George Bush says. Is that that I was listening to your presentation about how it's scarier that they believe what they, it's more convincing, but it's also scarier that they believe what they say than it isn't. I mean, in some ways, I would feel better about the world if I knew Bush knew we were lying. But more significantly, it's that the truth is it's not simply the lying. It's that the truth becomes irrelevant. There's a quote in my book, and I use it in a cover story I wrote this week in The Nation about the attack on the media from Michael Kinsley, that this administration, they give the impression of that the fact that they lie because they can't be bothered to tell the truth. If the telling the truth were easier, they would do that. It's just too much of a hassle. But seems to me who's really at fault here are the media, because the media come back the next day for more lies. They're quite aware that they're being lied to. I mean, in the last week, there were two very significant pieces of legislation that went completely under the radar, one having to do with mercury emissions, setting the standard for mercury emissions, another one having to do for nuclear storage in the Yucca Mountains. Now, these are complicated issues, and to tell you the truth, I don't understand them all that well, but I do know that the administration suppressed the studies that they themselves had commissioned, because those studies did not demonstrate what the administration wanted to show, which was that, hey, it's okay to do whatever we want to do in the first goddamn place. Now, those studies, the people who made these studies, the scientists, both inside and outside the administration, put themselves on the line and said, hey, no, this is not the case. And if you remember, you can pick almost any issue you want where this happened. Same thing happened with when they rewrote the Medicare issues, where they shut up that guy who said he'd be fired if he let. Happens over and over and over again, okay? And they denied that these studies existed at first, and then they said they didn't commission, whatever. They went over and over, entirely unbelievably, and the story disappears, okay? The story disappears in part because it's not that sexy, in part because it doesn't involve Michael Jackson and small boys, or there's no little blonde girl to get bulletins on every night. In other words, part of the problem is tabloidization. Part of the problem is a lack of attention span on the media. But part of the problem is they just won't stand up to this administration and say, damn it, we're tired of being lied to. We're not going to accept that standard. We went into this business for a different... Oh, I'll stop there. Good.
Mr. Dean.
Right. The reason I wanted to go last is I'm not sure why I'm on this panel. Now, these people all write about lies, deceit, and cover-ups. So they are secondary sources. I guess they put me here as a primary source today. And as a primary source, I sort of looked over this panel and got to know a little bit about them. I knew some of them beforehand. Certainly, I knew Maureen, who I've been reading since before my hair turned gray, but remarkably, hers is not, and she looks younger than ever. And I know Larry's work, and I must say that do yourself a favor. Google his name, go to his website, and look under his multimedia files for something called War On, as in war on drugs, war on poverty, and have a treat. And Larry, I must say, I didn't know about the war on masturbation. I was also thinking as I pulled up my seats, being attracted to attractive Maureen's, I'm not real glad that this is being broadcast on C-SPAN. My attractive Maureen might wonder where I'm sitting today. Eric, I know, because I had the pleasure of reviewing for the Washington Monthly his When Presidents Lie. I also happened to read his dissertation, which is the first part of the book, and he's the only guy I've ever met in my life who has a PhD in presidential lying. So after I read his dissertation, I wondered if Stanford passed those out for real-life experiences as well. Michael, I must say that your work, why people believe in weird things, I've always suspected because they were weird people, but was something of an epiphany for me. So I last night pulled it off the shelf and opened it up to the moment I remembered in reading the book, where I saw probably the most perfect description of the White House staff I'd ever read. And I'm not talking just about the staff I was on, but those who preceded and followed me, which I've had a chance to study. Let me just read the bullet points from this section on page 119. Veneration of the leader, inerrancy of the leader, omniscience of the leader, persuasive techniques, hidden agendas, deceit, financial and/or sexual exploitation, absolute truth, absolute morality. Well, he's not describing a White House, he's describing the elements of a cult. And I'm afraid that, Michael, is an awfully good description of most White Houses.
That's scary.
A little scary. John, I know because I've had the pleasure of doing his radio program on KPFK-FM on a couple of occasions. And it's unusual talk radio. It's unusual in the fact that it's actually intelligent talk radio. So he and I, as he said, do share our concern about what's going to happen to presidential records after this presidency leaves, something I've written at some length about in my Worse Than Watergate book. What I'm hoping John might get into today is a piece he wrote some years ago that stuck in my mind back in the mid-'80s, late '80s, where he found the real Nancy Davis, and not Nancy Davis Reagan, rather a Nancy Davis who was flipping hamburgers in Ventura County and had been the purported reason that Ronnie and Nancy got together. Well, he kind of put the lie to that story, and I'm hoping he'll share how he found her and how he put the lie to that story today, because it's fascinating that this woman says she was never a communist. She threatened that if Nancy Davis Reagan kept saying so, she was going to sue her. She stopped saying it for a few years. Then she resumed again, and it's, of course, become the official myth of that presidency and the meeting of these people. So I guess I'm here, obviously, to provide fair and balanced coverage of this group. Thank you.
I think what we're going to do is find out if we have questions for each other. And if we do, we'll talk a little here, and then we'll open the microphone, which is in the middle there, for questions from you. Michael, I have a question for you, okay? So here we are. We have a administration that, as Maureen said, is we're trying to turn the country into a theocracy. And it's always been my sense that the only difference between believing in weird cults and, or actually, I read a psychiatric definition, that the only difference between a delusional belief and an acceptable belief like a religion is the number of people who believe in it. Then this is your area of expertise. So my question is, how do we separate out what is delusional and what is a sensible belief, and why has delusional belief become an acceptable standard today? I mean, there was the study of the people who voted for Bush were all deluded about what he believed in, what other people believed in, and whether they were weapons of mass destruction and so forth.
Wow. I knew you were going to say that.
Right.
So turn on your telepathic powers right now. Yeah, well, that's a mouthful. Gosh, there's a lot there. Issues that we deal with, separation of church and state's obviously a big one for us, specifically with things like attempts to teach creationism in public schools, which has a political and religious agenda behind it, and the current administration's sort of emphasis on faith. How do you tell the difference? Well, that's what science does better than anything else, and this is why I'm such a pro-science guy, is because as deeply flawed as it may be and conducted by humans who are subject to all the same biases as everybody else, like the confirmation bias, looking for the hits and ignoring the misses and so on, it has a self-correcting machinery built into it, which requires you to look for your own misses and mistakes and biases, because if you don't, one of your colleagues with great glee will point it out. And so in that sense, science is also very competitive. And it's one of the reasons I trust the system. It's not a faith in science so much as it is confidence from its experience of being so productive and useful and good at what it does, that it is the best system we have for telling the difference between these things. And whatever the particular claim is. The problem is when it's loaded with, say, religious or political implications, then it's harder to get at it. So, for example, recently I was disturbed by this observations when Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear, came out the same week that Jared Diamond's Collapse came out. And it was very predictable. I could tell already what the reviews would say based on who wrote it and where the review was published. I didn't have to read a single word. Wall Street Journal, of course they're going to hate Jared's Collapse. And of course they're going to love Crichton's book. Predictable. Reason magazine, a libertarian magazine that I read and like, but they predictably loved Crichton's book and were skeptical of Jared's book. New York Times loved Collapse, hated, and said it, LA Times hated State of Fear. So there's something disturbing about that. And I think part of the problem is that in complicated scientific questions, like environmental questions, where the models are really complex and they're loaded with so many variables that it's really hard to say, then the data don't just speak for themselves, and you end up filtering them through these theories, the theories that themselves are loaded with political or religious ideologies and biases. And so I find myself very torn on, say, environmental issues and global warming, because it's not clear. It's clear that the Earth is getting warmer, say, for example, in the last 100 years, but it's not clear whether this is a part of a 1,000-year, 10,000-year, 100,000-year warming or cooling trend that could be partially human-caused, partially naturally caused, and so on. It's very complex. And that's why when you see, you know, that one network has the left-wing scientists on and the other one has the right-wing scientists, why aren't there scientists with no wings? Oh, which ones have the left wings? Oh, ABC, NBC, CBS.
Oh, really?
CNN. Yeah, yeah, they do. They do. So there, that's a, okay, good. Make you an honorary member of the Skeptics Society. You should be skeptical of the skeptics, by the way. I should point that out. So, you know, that in short, that's the problem. The facts don't just speak for themselves on these hard issues.
Can I ask Maureen a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maureen, you covered the Bush Senior White House correspondent, and both Bush, I wonder what it's, you have a relationship with them as a result of your work. Bush...
yeah, her nickname is Cobra.
The Cobra. They call her the Cobra. And Bush...
which is a lot better than Turd Blossom, which is what he calls his best friend.
And Bush Sr. complained that you put him on the couch. What do you make of this?
Both the father and the son complain about being put on the couch if you ask them questions that aren't about politics. But in both cases, I was doing a cultural interview with both of them. So I was just asking, what's your favorite movie, or do you watch TV? And they would say, don't put me on the couch. Don't psychoanalyze me. So they're very, even this president, who is all Texan all the time, but they have that WASP thing of not wanting to be introspective. And, you know, it's interesting. Oh, God. I know WASPs are the last group you can't make fun of. But when Eric was talking, I did remember one thing I wanted to say, which is... when I did ask Pat Oliphant, who's brilliant, I think, to do my cover, I started to tell him what I wanted, and he goes, stop. I read your column, I know. And he did exactly what I wanted, which was to have a cover that conveyed a different reality. And that was the point of the subtext, you know, that they didn't like the reality they were faced with in Iraq, where they couldn't prove, you know, there was any reason to go to war. So they created their own reality. And it's interesting because Ron Suskind did this piece for the New York Times, and there was a White House official who actually gave a quote that said, journalists, you know, you're in the reality-based community. As though reality were something else, you know. And he said they created their own reality. So it's not, you know, it's way beyond lying. It's like just taking a reality. And since the president doesn't read the newspapers or anything, Cheney can put, if he has a fever about going to war with Iraq, he can just put a filter on the information that he gets, and Condi, suppressed information and studies that would have debunked things. So they suppressed everything that would have debunked things and ginned up everything that didn't. And the father and son are similar in one sense. I mean, the son ran away from everything about the father. The father was an internationalist, so the son had to be unilateralist. The father was a Episcopalian, so the son had to be an evangelical. So, the father was sort of Greenwich, so the son had to be West Texas. And so, but the one thing that they're alike in is they don't really connect words and actions. And they, the father, when he got in trouble for saying, read my, lips, no new taxes, he didn't understand that was a pledge. He thought that was just a line that Peggy Noonan put in the speech to make him seem like Gary Cooper. He wasn't... and the son is the same way, and they have this, we know best, we'll handle it. You, the American public, have not been bred to lead. We will handle it, and then we'll let you know how it comes out. And that's where I differ with them, so.
Yeah, well, I just would like to add a footnote that it really expands way beyond the Bushes themselves. The study you referred to with the University of Maryland, which I cited in my book, is just a phenomenal analysis of what's going on. Just the week before everyone went to the poll last November, the University of Maryland, with a totally non- or unpartisan study, tried to find out the attitudes of Bush voters versus Kerry voters. What they found is pretty startling. For example, on the issue of weapons of mass destruction, they found that 72% of the Bush voters believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq justifying the invasion of Iraq. They believed that 75% of the Bush voters believed that there was a tie between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Yes, some of the Kerry voters got it wrong. It was around in the low 20s. So we do have totally different realities. When I tried to dig a little deeper, which the Maryland study did not do, but tried to look to see where this misinformation is coming from, I've got to share with you, a lot of it's coming from pulpits, where the ministers are telling the flock what they should believe, and they're believing it.
Can I ask Jonathan? By the way, a footnote to that, there was a previous study by the same program on policy attitudes at University of Maryland about where people get their information, and 81% of Fox News viewers believed all three of the lies that they set up, and only 22% of the people who said that their primary news source was either the New York Times, CBS News, or NPR believed even one of those lies. And there's, of course, a direct correlation between believing those lies and supporting the war and not. And so you really had to believe something that was false to support the war. Here's my question for Mr. Dean. I played kind of a macabre game with myself leading up till November, or I guess it was up till John Kerry got the nation, of who I would support over if they were running against George Bush. I would happily have supported his dad if he had gotten the Democratic nomination. I would happily have supported Bob Dole. I toyed with myself about Richard Nixon. I went back and forth. And I'll tell you why, and then I want you to...
He'd be a good Green candidate. Nixon.
But here's actually the serious point of my question. Nixon was a weirdo, for sure. And, he would send Fred Malloch to go count the Jews, make sure there weren't too many Jews in any one department. But the Nixon administration, for all of the psychosis that manifested itself on those tapes, it seemed to have a real respect for competence. And they had some tough guys and some ideologues. And the same is actually true of Ronald Reagan. But there wasn't a sense that everybody has to be on board with everything, and that we can't allow anyone, almost like kind of like the Politburo, we can't allow anyone to speak anything that's off the reservation at all. And yet, in the Bush administration, as I was trying to communicate earlier, it's not just a simple matter of people giving the politically convenient answer to every question. It's that across the board, there's sort of an ideological answer to every single matter, and it's in the Justice Department, the Environmental Department, and the Department of Interior, in HHS, you know. And it's as if reality doesn't enter into the question, or if it does, it's something that needs to be explained away, which was not true of Nixon. It was not nearly as true as Reagan, and it certainly wasn't as true of George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, I have two hypotheses that I'd like to run by you of what's changed, and then I want you to tell me what you think it is. And I'm not saying I'm right about either one. One is that they didn't have, in your day, they didn't have Fox News. They didn't have this entire right-wing media structure that is willing to go out and say, yes, in fact, we have found weapons of mass destruction, and Dan Rather doesn't want you to know about it. And so that the whole idea of a normative set of facts that we can agree on has been lost because so much of our news is entirely ideology. And the second change is that in those days, there was a Republican Party that had a multiplicity of views. And now, if there's anybody in the Republican Party who doesn't believe that the United States is a divinely inspired experiment by God and that everything we do is therefore blessed by God, you don't hear much from them. In other words, there's this religious certainty that is expressed, and there's no one, if you even question religious certainty, you're questioning the whole edifice. So it seems to me that when you add those two things together, this terrifying religious certainty these people have, and the fact that within the structure that's set up in the Constitution to keep our democracy accountable, there are people undermining it, there are structures there to undermine it, that they can get away with a lot more than you guys could get away with before you became such a great guy.
Eric, either subject would be a good book. But let me give you a quick answer. You're right. There was no Fox News. In fact, the media before Watergate was an entirely different media than we have post-Watergate. Before Watergate, presidents were generally given the benefit of the doubt and assumed to be doing the right thing. Post-Watergate, they were assumed to be guilty, and until they proved the negative that they were innocent. That was really the case up until 2000, and it sort of hung on for Al Gore even during the 2000 campaign, but not very much for George Bush from the get-go. He was given a pass. And there's no question that there is a whole other element with talk radio and the right having its chorus out there to keep banging away on their key talking points of the day. What's interesting is that Nixon used to complain about the fact that this wasn't the case. He's the one who said, we don't have enough right-wing think tanks, we don't have enough right-wing media, and he was very much on this case. And had he completed a second term, I suspect some of these actions would have taken place much sooner than they did. So that he was very aware of this problem, and it has changed the complexion. As far as the GOP and the Republican Party, well, you've got to remember where this whole change in the party, where it goes below the Mason-Dixon line and finds the conservatives who used to be Democrats, who are now all Republicans. This starts with really Goldwater. Goldwater doing it with some success, Nixon seeing the door open, going through in '68, but then being totally outdone by George Wallace, who could far out demonize and politicize the so-called wedge issues than Richard Nixon could begin to. But in '72, Nixon reached again and brought a lot of those people into the tent. And that's what started changing the complexion of the party. I must say that I don't think my views have changed a whole lot, but I find myself way on the left today as opposed to where the Republican Party is. So there have been changes, and they do impact, but I would add one other thing, that every president has a tremendous impact on the way his government and his administration works. If a president wears hats, his staff is wearing hats. If a president has fires in the fireplace in the Oval Office, his staff does the same. It's remarkable how these patterns start. And you've got a unique situation with this presidency, and that I'm not sure who's running the show. You've got one guy who's a salesman and the other guy who's minding the store in Dick Cheney. And that really has influenced a lot. Cheney might well be open to listening to alternative views. I don't think George Bush is. So that's influenced tremendously the way this presidency operates.
If we have questions from the floor, you got to go up to the microphone there. And I see somebody who's up there already. And, sir.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Dean. Great respect for you and how you've come out like you have in your writing at FindLaw.com. I can tell you exactly who's running the show with the Bush regime. It's the Likudnik neoconservatives, most of whom are Jewish, as Mr. Altman had written about in his Nation magazine piece, Can We Talk?
I'm sorry, you're mischaracterizing
No, I'd
what
like
I
to
said.
justify the Bamford book that explains this in detail.
I didn't say that.
Hold
Let's
on,
just stay on the record. I didn't
bringing
say
it up.
that,
It's
and I
James-
wouldn't say that.
James, I'm telling you, sir, you have an article from April 21st, 2003. I have it in my hand. And you said that there's a taboo to talk about the Likudnik neocon agenda. The Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs,
Is
the
there a
Project for the
question?
New American Century. Why are we talking about James Bamford and his pretext for War Book? He should be on this panel. It's a disgrace that he's not and that he's never been invited to this discussion.
Hi, sir.
Or the Festival of
Sir.
Books ever.
Thank you. Next, please.
I promise not to be as rancorous. It seems that the right in politics today have learned effectively that consumerism and creating a product through lying and associations and developing a strong support system on the religious right and other aspects of the right have really nailed it in terms of how to sell themselves. And I wonder whether the left is shooting themselves in the foot by maintaining a kind of moral high ground about being truthful. And essentially, should they be learning how to package themselves? And are they going to be the second party in this country forever because they are not, haven't learned that lesson? So is lying okay and necessary in a consumer culture is the issue.
Anybody got an answer to that? If
It's a
not,
big
I do.
country, you know.
I think the trick is to learn how to package whatever it is that you got rather than make up something new to have. So, I mean, Democrats who aren't particularly religious suddenly repackaging themselves as anti-abortionists who pray a lot is silly. But people who have strong, passionate feelings, learning how to articulate them clearly in a way that people understand them and will respond to them positively is something that I think, yes, the Democratic Party needs to do. Any disputes
No.
with that one?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add,
Go for it.
the first time I really noticed the difference, I mean, I'm sure it was before this, but with what I was covering was during the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings. And it just dawned on me that the Democrats were sort of, you know, trying to figure out what really happened while the Republicans didn't care. They were just playing to win, and they were throwing everything at this woman. And the two techniques were so different. And then I've just seen it played out in everything since then, like South Carolina. You know, McCain was just kind of hit with everything in South Carolina to the point where he really lost his breath and didn't even know how to respond because he could not believe how personal W had been. But then in the end, Americans love winners. So then when Bush wins, you know, he has that potency of the winner. So I think the Republicans feel, you know, they don't really care what the truth of it is or what the tactics are because they want to win. And I don't know, you know, again, it's an ends justifies the means things. I don't think Democrats have to stoop to those tactics, but they do have to certainly be more muscular about how they go about fighting.
Next.
On the issue of politics and religious cults, I was wondering if anybody had any insights on why the mainstream media has given so little attention to the emergence of Sun Myung Moon as a major power broker in Washington, and why, if you want to get the truth, you have to read weblogs and alternative media sources.
The second article I ever published in my entire life. I'm kind of pissed off about this because it's the one time in my life I was smarter than Michael Kinsley. He called the article In Moon's Orbit, which is okay. I wanted to call the article Bad Moon Rising. But anyway, I wrote that article. It was in 1983 or 4 or 5, something like that. And then it was a story, and people got the story, and now they've decided that it's not important. Now, sometimes that's because everybody has all the information they need, and the fact that it's not really that important that Sung Young Moon owns the Washington Times, because you know what the Washington Times is and the other properties that he owns. But sometimes it's just because the media lose interest in a certain story, and there's no way to make them interested. I think it's very interesting that, for instance, on that point, that yesterday the Senate approved John Negroponte as head of the head of the new intelligence arm. John Negroponte, he's not responsible. He is. We have the papers on him. He was engaged in helping the Salvadorans cover up massacres in the 1980s. Now, he didn't give them any green lights to have any massacres, which, by the way, some U.S. officials appear to have done. But he knew that they had taken place, and he made sure that there was nothing done to prevent future massacres and to stop them. We have the papers. We have the memos. It's all there. He can't deny it. And yet, it's just like, it's too much of a hassle to go into it. They were fighting Bolton on the one side, so John Negroponte is getting a pass, and the vote was 98-2. And it seems to me that there's an awful lot of issues that just the system can't handle, or that because part of the big problem with the debate over the war was that the Democrats couldn't be found to make an issue of it. But it seems to me that our system, and maybe there's no other way to do it, but our system so narrowly chooses what it's going to fight about that enormous amounts are lost. And for instance, to me, I think it's quite significant that we chose as the one person to be the most influential person on our entire intelligence committee as someone who has a past of covering up massacres. You know, I think that's a pretty significant problem. Just the same, it seems to me, strikes me the same principle as Alan Weinstein being the head archivist. I mean, it's kind of like a principle that this administration has, that you find the worst imaginable human being for a job and you give it to them. But again, where are the media? Where are the media?
This is a question that involves the whole panel because it's about lying, but I'm going to direct it to Cobra Woman. What, at this point, are the chances of Judy Miller heading for the Slammer? The Martha Stewart wing, of course, but the Slammer nonetheless.
Well, I guess according to what I read in the New York Times, and good. The chances are good she's going to end up in the clink because the Bush administration has just kind of systematically gone after the press and tried. Oh, this is another thing about the reality-based community. They've tried to replace the press. It's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers with their own version of the press. People like Armstrong Williams that are paid to, you know, spread the word on No Child Left Behind, and Jeff Gannon, you know, a male escort, could get into the White House. Yeah.
Bulldog,
Yeah, could get into the White House, but my White House pass was taken away. So they think they can replace the press, you know, and it's a very ominous, and then the ones they can't replace, they'll go after and put in jail. And the remarkable thing about Judy is she didn't even write a story. She just thought about it. So now we're into thought police, you know, and it's really scary.
No, my understanding on that is they leaked this story to 6 people. 5 of them refused to take the story and write about it. 1 of them did. They're going after the ones who didn't write the story.
I know.
You know, let me just add one thing. There was a decision came down on Tuesday of last week from the full United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, who turned down the appeal of Miller and Cooper. Knowing that there's something that's interesting and lurking in this whole story, though, that no one really quite knows what's going on. When Judge Hogan, the chief judge, he's the chief judge of the district court, held the contempt citations as valid and acted on Fitzpatrick's motion, he filed an affidavit, and it was sealed. Part of the appeal was the fact that it was an ex parte proceeding, and nobody other than the prosecutor and the judge know what's in this document. But the judge gave just enough of a hint. He said the investigation shifted during the course of the investigation, and these are very important witnesses. Judge Hogan happened to be a classmate of mine and a friend of mine, and actually one time my attorney. He's a very cautious man. I can't believe he would let Fitzpatrick go off on a lark. So I don't think we know all the facts here of why Fitzpatrick feels he has to have this testimony and why he's banging away at this. So we don't have a full, complete picture to make a judgment on it.
John, is there any way you can tell this story to yourself without Robert Novak having testified?
Well, you know, I think he might have taken the fifth.
But why would the judge accept that? Why wouldn't the judge
Well, you
put him in
can't-
the same position?
Well, then you have to go through a whole immunity proceeding, and they may have thought it not worth it. I don't know. He is obviously, there are two people who could solve this problem. One is Novak, two are whoever leaked the information. If they came forward and said, hey, we're the leak, we don't want a miscarriage of justice, we don't want Miller and Cooper going to jail and are hiding behind it, that would resolve the issue. So it's just not Novak, it's also the leakers who are the cowards in this play.
It's soundbite time. We're down about 6 minutes here, so if we could keep the questions and the answers to soundbites. And really,
I had a question. I keep believing that George Bush or Dick Cheney, I don't know who went first, said, but George Bush would more naturally say, my father got screwed out of being reelected. This guy, Saddam Hussein, did it. If I get elected president, we're going in there and we're going to take him out. It wouldn't matter 9/11. It wouldn't have mattered anything. And somewhere, I think, there's a hidden piece of paper somewhere or something on some computer where one of them says to the other, if you don't agree, you're not on my ticket. You can't run for the... I really believe they had it planned ahead of time.
Well, I think the reasons we went to war are kind of a perfect storm of reasons that everybody had their own reason, and I think this president's reason was partly to, you know, avenge and one-up his father, but it played into other reasons that the neocons had, you know, in terms of remaking the Middle East, and it played into other reasons that Dick Cheney had about wanting to smack somebody so that the Arabs wouldn't look cross-eyed at us again and that America could establish the principle of being a hyperpower. So, and Rumsfeld wanted to prove that he could transform the military and do things with a smaller, agile force. So everybody had different reasons and they all interlocked.
Yeah, Maureen's absolutely right, and it's something to keep in mind. Not everything in life has one reason. Lots of things in life have many reasons. It may have been a war for oil, it may have been a war for strategic primacy in the Middle East, it may have been a war for Halliburton, it may have been a war for, because he tried to kill my daddy. It may have been a war because they wanted to kick some Arab ass and let the Arabs know that that's the kind of thing they're going to get if they try to. Maybe any one of these things, maybe all of them, for different people it was different things. And you don't need to identify the single reason, you just need to understand how the decisions were reached and try to reach better ones in the future, one hopes.
okay. One more over here.
All right. So I grew up in an evangelical Christian home, and what Mr. Dean said is true. They're always from the pulpit. A lot of times people will say over and over again that the left and the New York Times is out to hate, they hate Christianity and they hate God and they want to destroy us. So don't read the New York Times, don't read that because they're against you. But I just want to say, don't you find in some sense, well, it's not hate that there's a grain of truth to the disrespect for religion on the left, and how can we expect people in the South, or even just people here in California, who religion is the center of their lives, to come over their side, to our side, when we seem to not have respect for what's the center of their life?
Well, I think you've got to distinguish between what you mean when you say the left. Sure, there are people on the left who have contempt for religion, and they're quite open and vocal about
Michael
it.
Shermer, for example, with respect to his views,
No, but
with respect, I mean...
No, but wait a minute, wait a minute. Michael didn't say that.
atheist-
Michael was cautious about that. I
But
said that.
wait a minute. There are all kinds of people in all kinds of places who believe all kinds of things. And to say that, A, the New York Times is the left strikes me, A, as a ridiculous statement. But even so...
I didn't say the New York
okay,
Times
no, but
is the left.
to the equation that is frequently made, I'm not saying you made it, but you did actually go the New York Times
I'm
and the
just
left
saying
haters.
the perception in the evangelical community
Here's my point.
is.
Yeah, but here's my point. It's easy to pick up and say, oh, look, Michael Moore is offensive and therefore I hate the Democrats, okay? But Michael Moore is not a Democratic candidate. John Kerry was. And for some reason, you can have like a Jerry Falwell saying that the United States got what it deserved on 9/11, and the Republicans and the conservatives somehow don't pay a political price for that. But you have Michael Moore doing what many people feel to be, honestly feel to be disrespectful of the country and the president, and yet that is blamed in the national media on the Democratic candidate. Noam Chomsky wasn't the Democratic candidate. Michael Moore wasn't the Democratic candidate. Ward Churchill is not the Democratic candidate. Ann Coulter says, you know, we should kill journalists. It's the first chance we get, and yet there's no price to be paid. So I think that part of the problem is our culture's inability to make these kind of distinguishments. Sure, there are lots of people on the left who have contempt for religion, but there are a lot of very religious people on the left. And why is this monochromatic picture the one that is operating in our media's mind?
John. One last question here, John. You want to ask John Dean?
Yeah, I want to just point out that John Dean is the only person on this panel who really changed his mind about American politics over the last 30 years, and that makes him sort of a hero. And as most people, to the extent that people do change their mind in American politics, as they get older and grayer, they tend to move to the right. John Dean hasn't done that, and I think that's why we appreciate him. And I just wanted to ask, what is his secret?
Well, maybe I can answer this with a story. There's a story about George Bush being down in Crawford and out bicycling, and went by and saw a little boy in a front yard with a box of puppies, and asked the boy what kind of puppies these were, and he said, they're all Republican puppies. And George said, nice, that's wonderful, son, and bicycled on. About a week later, he's bicycling again with Laura with him, and he said, winks at her, says, come see this. And he sees the little boy with his box of puppies, and he said, son, what kind of puppies are those? And he said, they're Democrats. What do you mean they're Democrats? Well, they opened their eyes.